as you all are probably aware, this is a program that's called Hungry Ducktales. And I just want to thank you all for joining today. We are going to be learning about some of the amazing wildlife that we have here in Nevada and just wildlife in general as well. My name is Lauren McLeod. I am the Southern Region Urban Wildlife Coordinator for the Nevada Department of Wildlife. We also have Claire Clark helping out today, and she's an amazing AmeriCorps wildlife educator here with the Department of Wildlife as well. And Claire is going to have the very important duty of answering questions throughout this webinar as well. So you'll notice, I know a lot of you have made use of this chat box that we have, answering that question that was on our prior slide regarding some of the ways that you can observe wildlife. There is also a question and answer box that you'll see in that same toolbar. And that's a really great opportunity if anything that we're discussing today seems confusing or you want clarification on, or if you just have any general questions on the topic or similar to the topic, feel free to pop any of your questions in there. And Claire is going to be answering those. And when she does answer them, they'll be available for all of us to view as well. So I'll definitely be looking at the chat box throughout this, but she'll kind of be doing the Q&A side of things. So I'm not going to be monitoring that as much, but I would love to hear some of y'all's input in the chat as well. Just make sure if you do have specific questions, it's probably a better avenue to use that question and answer so you can get a better answer while we're doing this program. And before we get started, just going over some of those webinar basics, we mentioned the question and answer and the chat box feature. We'll also want everyone to participate to the best of their ability. It really helps me to make me feel like I'm not talking to myself as much if y'all do use those chats and Q&A options, just so that we can really have some open discussion about this and, really get a conversation going to the best of our abilities. And just keep in mind too that this is a PG rated program, so anything that we are typing in those avenues, we want to make sure that they're appropriate and respectful of the participants and everyone that's involved in this webinar this evening. And if you're calling into, I'm definitely going to try to illustrate things to the best of my ability. We are using a PowerPoint presentation, so there definitely are some visuals, but I'll try to make sure that I explain everything that we're describing on these slides as well. So the topic of this webinar, we're going to focus on some of the effects that can occur, the impacts of feeding wildlife, whether that's in our yards, in a wild environment, and elsewhere. So let's start first with discussing where it all began. So the history of feeding wildlife and how that affects, some of the things that we do today. It's really interesting to look back on the connection that humans have to the wildlife around us. And I'm sure all of us can relate in some way or another, that connection that we do hold, even with the separation of, urban environments and the development and some of our, technology advancements. There are still some innate behaviors and some innate connections that we have with the wildlife that surround us. And so some pretty interesting historical blurbs that I came upon when learning a little bit about the history of feeding wildlife. I have up here on the screen something that was discovered recently. There were Saudi carvings of dogs on leashes that dated back 8,000 to 9,000 years. And so you'll see that in that bottom left picture there that was found. And this just shows, a potential depiction of whether it's the domestication of dogs or elsewhere to determine or to help them hunt. There's a lot of really neat history. One of the earliest mentions of feeding wild birds is found in Hindu writings of the Vedic era. And that was about 3,500 years ago. And the texts essentially describe a practice that stipulates the provision of food, traditionally rice cakes for birds, but also for other animals like dogs, insects. And it is essentially a way to find spirituality in one way or another. Also featured in ancient Egyptian writings were peregrine falcons. You'll see a peregrine falcon up at this bottom right corner, and these falcons were a part of a religious ritual and sacrifice. And in order to meet the demand of the falcons required for some of these rituals, there were royal families that would essentially maintain these large fields just to grow the food required to supplement for the falcons themselves. And, even the domestication of dogs, some of the domestication of dogs dates back, anywhere between 10 to 30,000 years ago. So there has been feeding, whether it's in the role of domestication of animals or spiritual connection. We have a very rich history of feeding wildlife in our human history. And so I would like us to use the chat. Again, I know some of y'all were great about using the chat in that first question I had when we got started. But let's think about where we are today with our connection to wildlife. So think about, why do we feed wildlife? Or do our actions as humans prompt us to want to give back in some way? So I would love to hear your input if you have anything to share of why you think, we might be feeding wildlife today. Awesome. Karen says she gives $20 a month to the ASPCA. That's great. And so, donating to foundations that provide for the care of wildlife and other animals and, help with the richness and health of our diversity of animals and wildlife. That's wonderful. And if anyone else would like to share, what do we think about our connection to wildlife today? Joanne, yeah, we like to help them. Absolutely. And I see Noreen, you said, I feed my wild birds so they know they're eating healthy. Yeah, absolutely. And Karen says, I don't like to feed wildlife because I don't want them to get used to humans and human food. And that's a great answer too. And we'll get into that. Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you all. And maybe that makes us feel connected to them. Absolutely. So again, I mean, just like the history of feeding and domesticating animals, we do have this sort of want to connect with our surroundings in some way or another. And feeders for birds, yeah, absolutely. And again, too, for any of you that are using the chat, if you do want to share it with everyone, there is an option in the drop-down menu where you can send the chat to all panelists and attendees, and that allows for everyone to see it in addition to just me and Claire as well. And so the history of our connection is, it possibly dates back to the start of our history as humans. And so, just as providing food to a visitor in our own homes, this gives us an opportunity to offer gratitude or hospitality to someone. Feeding animals typically stems from a desire to connect, and in the best form of communication that we know how to, just as we had mentioned in the chat. So there's this, there's this want to foster a connection. And, I have some images here that describe some of those connections. It's, it's often with the best intentions, be it gratitude, curiosity, or just plain friendship that we wish to offer wildlife something in return. And this is often rationalized that feeding wildlife doesn't necessarily do any harm. And that is something that we're going to go into a little bit today, some of the harm that it might cause and some of the good that it might cause as well. And so, some of the ways that we might be feeding wildlife, and some of these that were mentioned in the chat, is that feeling of usefulness or gaining the trust of animals or increasing public awareness. So, you go to an area where feeding wildlife is a part of an organization, whether it's a wildlife refuge or somewhere that has that, you want to increase a concern for the wildlife, then sometimes developing that connection can help you to do so. Other times it's just for entertainment or a way to get a good photo of an animal to encourage it to get close to you. And then there are two different kinds of feeding wildlife, and one is that intentional feeding of wildlife. And this can absolutely be necessary in captive environments where wild animals depend completely upon human husbandry, such as in wildlife rehabilitation or in zoos. It also occurs across the spectrum of semi-captive and wild environments that, we've probably witnessed or been a part of ourselves. So some of those things we see here where, we are in a semi-wild or wild environment and coming across these animals and providing them food in that way or another. And in addition to intentional, we may have witnessed some of the unintentional feeding. And this occurs when wild animals are attracted to garbage, compost, landfills, gardens, fruit trees, pet food, the list goes on. Anything that we might have left out in our yard accidentally or left out for a different animal. And we might see some familiarity in some of these photos. I know I have personally, there are animals that want to access some food that you might leave out. We can't really necessarily discriminate that food source from one animal to another. I know especially in the state of Nevada, we have a lot of these animals that we see pictured here that do these exact actions. So there are those intentional forms of feeding and those unintentional forms of feeding as well. And so Karen asks, is that coyote eating a pizza? Yes, it is. It looks like it probably found a pizza party somewhere and wanted to join in on the fun. And so it's running away with what looks like at least half of an entire pizza. And so we are going to dig into a little bit of the impacts as it regards feeding wildlife as it pertains to the animals itself, which we're going to start with. But we're also going to discuss the impacts on humans and the impacts of the environment that feeding wildlife can have. And so to start, and these are just the negative impacts that we're going to be discussing first. And these are just some of them listed, and we'll kind of dig through each of them individually. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to just pop them in the question and answer as we go along. But of course, you can definitely put any comments too in the chat, or anything you want to share with all of us in the chat as well. And I just want to say again, I do appreciate your participation in the chat. It's really nice to see engagement during this too. So thank you. So let's start with one of the impacts on animals that was shown in that last slide is poor nutrition. So, wild animals, just like ourselves, we have very specialized diets. For humans, even us, we have specialized diets. We're not going to be eating the bark off a tree. We have certain dietary needs. We have certain carbohydrates and protein needs and things that are required for our health and survival. And just like that, wild animals do too. So if they're fed in diet that's not appropriate to what their wild diet is, it can lead to malnutrition. It can also lead to, sickness and death too. So it's something to be really cautious of. This photo here on the left, you see of a squirrel. You might notice that that squirrel is a little overweight as it has the remnants of what might have been an entire loaf of bread in its hand. And, these things aren't really meant for the natural diet of a squirrel. Those excess carbs can lead to an unhealthy behavior, but also a malnutrition in these squirrels too. And on the right too, this is actually a white goose that was that's in Sunset Park in the Las Vegas area, and this is just one of many waterfowl that have what's called angel wing. And angel wing is essentially the result of being fed by humans, usually bread or anything with carbohydrates, bread, crackers, things like that. And essentially, what it is it causes a protein deficiency or protein excess in their wings during development. And so their wings end up sticking straight out because their feathers and quills don't form in quite the correct way during that very important stage of development, and creates this wing deformity that's essentially irreversible and ends up preventing flight altogether, or limiting it in some capacity or another, which can cause a ricochet of different effects from that as well. And feeding bread especially, or anything like that, or any food that's that's, not something that will last long in a wild environment, can create mold and moldy leftovers. Those can lead to fatal lung infections or other sicknesses that, might even kill an entire flock of waterfowl if they're moldy leftovers an entire flock is feeding off of. And in addition to the poor nutrition that specialized or unspecialized diets can form, so human food on animals, some animals, many mammals, have specific kinds of digestive bacteria that help them to digest part of their diets, especially in ungulates, so mule deer or bighorn sheep. Any herbivores that eat those grasses and shrubs, they actually have specific bacteria in their digestive system that helps them to digest these different foods. And so these deer here, they rely on microorganisms in those stomachs to break down the plant material that they consume. The downside, though, is that microorganisms are needed to tackle different plant material. And so say a diet of new shoots and other spring growth, that will lead to the deer to have a different stomach microbe compared to a diet of bark and woody shrubs. So if you think about the different plants that are growing during different seasons, these deer have time to develop those different microbes seasonally and get used to those different bacterial growths in their digestive system to digest those different plants that are growing seasonally in their environment. And so since time is needed, switching between those human handouts and natural foods, that occurs at a more rapid pace because all of a sudden these human foods, they might be getting that they're used to getting in the spring and now they're getting in the winter. Their microbes aren't really caught up to digest that material. And this can actually lead to death in these animals. So this is, we'll find situations where these animals have died of starvation, but died of starvation with full stomachs because they have this material in their stomach, but they were never able to actually digest it. So they're still dying from starvation in those instances. It can also cause the spread of disease. So when we think about wild animals gathering in large numbers around feeding sites, this allows them to come in close proximity with one another that they might not necessarily always do. So many wild animals, they don't interact with others or others of whether their own species or other species except during mating season or maybe when they're raising their young. And this is kind of a natural way and is natural behavior in many animals to limit the spread of disease. It's to make sure that they are not becoming vulnerable to any pathogens that might be spreading among species of their own kind. And so when we are gathering these species in large numbers with one another, that kind of gives an opportunity for those diseases to spread a little bit more quickly. And the list of diseases that we found in animals at feeding sites can go on and on and on. These are just some of them listed here, just to give you kind of an idea. So, chronic wasting disease, that's spread by exposure to urine, saliva, feces. All of these get mixed together when animals congregate at feeders. Canine distemper, that's something that can be found in a lot of canine species, so foxes, coyotes, raccoons. It can be found in some felines, not all of them. But that is essentially a bacterial growth as well, or parasitic growth that causes distemper in those animals. Something else that it can cause is delayed migration. And this is really important, especially at some of our urban ponds as well. We'll notice that there are some birds that decide to stay year-round at these urban ponds. And, if you were in a situation of a bird that has a ready supply of food year-round, you're not going to leave. If you're being fed, you don't have to work hard for those food sources. You're going to stick around. It's easy food. You want to find habitat that you're comfortable in. So why would you leave? But, when you think about the seasonality of an area, there are very good reasons for birds migrating. And a lot of that is to follow a season in which they can tolerate those temperatures. And so when we see temperatures that are rising and falling in an area, those birds might not be necessarily adapted to those temperature fluctuations. And if they delay migration too long, you know, if the weather becomes too cold or too hot for them, then it's harder for them to migrate altogether and they might stick around. And at that point, you know, they might struggle to survive just due to those temperature fluctuations. And injury is something that can be caused, you know, for a variety of reasons. Again, going back to those urban ponds though, you'll notice I have a photo of an angler. You know, we see fishermen and fisherwomen all over our urban ponds and other waterways everywhere. You know, it's a great way to recreate. But when you cast a line, and if birds are used to being fed, it looks very similar in motion. So if you look at these two photos, you'll see, you know, birds can't necessarily differentiate between a fishing line and someone tossing food. It looks like the same exact motion to them. And so when those birds get used to humans as a food source, they're going to get close to folks that are recreating and anglers that are recreating. And, you know, we run into problems like ducks getting fishing line caught in their wings or their foot and things like that. It can lead to a lot of different injuries. And as a side note to that too, when animals are congregating with one another, that can also lead to injury. You have this aggressive competition for a food source in a tight area, and so they start to compete with one another as well. And I also want to add to that too, and this has nothing to do with feeding wildlife, but I do want to say that most of our urban ponds do have these really cool monofilament recycling bins you'll see next to the trash can here. So if you are fishing out there, we encourage you to use them or use the trash bins too if you don't see those readily available. But this also prevents injury to waterfowl and other birds and animals that might be in the area and other people too. We do see a lot of fishing line that might not be disposed properly, and thus injuries can occur in the animals and ourselves as well. So if you're out fishing, please use those. It's a great way to make sure that our areas are kept clean and safe for the animals and the people that are enjoying them too. Something else too is undeveloped foraging skills. And so this really only occurs in young animals. We're not going to see this so much in animals that are raised in a wild environment and then adapt to handouts from humans. But when young animals at a young age are, taught to associate humans with food, they don't necessarily learn, or they might not necessarily learn those same behaviors in foraging that they would in a wild environment. So it causes them to become fully dependent on humans as a food source, and it can make them more prone to predation too, so to predators that might want to eat them as well. So, most animals, they remain pretty vigilant when they're foraging. So they'll, look out for their surroundings as they're foraging. They'll be fully aware of their surroundings, especially true for ground foragers like doves, quail, or this rabbit here too. So in a natural environment, they'll try to remain close to cover where they can hide out. But if you notice in typical areas where they're being fed by humans, it's usually in an open area. So an area where they're a little bit more vulnerable to predation. And if they start to associate that sort of environment with a food source, then they can tend to remain in more open areas and thus be a little bit more vulnerable to predation that way as well. And Jeannie says, when dealing with a lot of pelican catching lines and fishermen, cut the lines, leaving the bird in peril. Yeah, absolutely. And, we see that at some of our ponds too, is, when birds get caught in these lines, it is really difficult to come up with a resolution in these ways. So, the best way to, fix this problem is just prevent the problem and, really ensure that we're not allowing these animals to make that association of humans as a food source, because we do notice that in areas where they are fed by humans, that's where we do see some of the most injuries from fishing lions. So it's always good to, we can definitely enjoy wildlife, and I encourage it. Of course, I love wildlife, as you might assume, but we want to make sure that we're doing it in a respectful manner. And, when they get too comfortable around humans, that is where we can run into issues like injury or, other issues as well. Something else too is altered reproduction rates. And so what I mean by that is essentially feeding, so providing human handouts may increase the reproductive success. So that means they reproduce more, so their populations get higher. And we think about that, and that sounds like a good thing. It's like, oh, okay, like feeding these animals will make more of these animals. It'll help their population. But it can actually have negative impacts instead, which is pretty unfortunate, and it kind of has to do with the carrying capacity, so the food that's available in a natural environment to these animals. So in the wild, the number of animals being born is essentially directly related to the amount of natural food available. So I'll pull up a chart. It's called the carrying capacity, and this is essentially describing just that, is you know, that food source going along with the population size, and that's their carrying capacity. So it's the amount of individuals that can survive in a certain habitat with the amount of food that is available in that habitat. And that's essentially nature's way of just keeping a balance. And so when an unnatural food supply becomes available, animals may produce more young, and soon there may be more animals living in an area than what the natural food source can support for them. And so the reason we see this curved chart, so think about this, you know, the start of this chart, this is time equals 0. This is a population just starting in an environment. This up here is the amount of food that is available. So that carrying capacity, that's the amount of food that's available for those animals. And so they start out, they start reproducing here, and then they have more animals to reproduce. And so all of a sudden we get this exponential curve. And then when they start to reach the carrying capacity, so the food that's available, their population growth just naturally evens out a little bit. So they just stop producing as often or as frequently because there's a food supply, and there's only, you know, there's only so much for the demand that's available. But when we introduce unnatural food sources, it kind of adds some different elements to it. So if we think about it in a human-derived way, so think about going to a supermarket, and it's a supermarket you've been going to for years. It's great. It has all the food you want. And then there is more development in your neighborhood. And then all of a sudden, twice as many people are going to the same supermarket. So you want to go to the market. You want to get a melon from the market. This market only has a limited supply of melons, but now there's all of these new people that also want to get melons from the supermarket. And so essentially you want to compete with these other people to get that melon, but everyone else in the shop also wants to make their fruit salad. So think about what you would do. You'd try and get the fruit first. Maybe you'd get to the shop earlier. You might knock down other shoppers or children out of your way. You know, this is competition. You are trying to get the food for your fruit salad just as your neighbors are. And so, and invariably some will succeed and some won't at the expense of others. So this is kind of what's described when an unnatural food source is introduced. This is just an example here. This is an interference with that carrying capacity. This is showing an unrestricted deer population and how it can diminish the habitat as a result. So just like with the supermarket, you know, we're all going to try to get the melons. This may be an inconvenience to us, you know. To a wild animal, not being able to find a sufficient food source can spell disaster though, because without it, you know, death is to follow and the population will decrease in size until there are fewer animals than food items, or, you know, more melons than shoppers. So we see this carrying capacity. We see all of these years, their increase in population size, they've exceeded that carrying capacity. And so now there's not enough food available for them. That competition starts occurring. And so then we see a drastic drop in their population size because there's not enough food to sustain them. And you'll notice too in this chart, the carrying capacity as a result has also gone down, because something to keep in mind with more animals, there is a resulting habitat damage. So all of these animals competing in that one area results in a time period where it will take for that vegetation to regrow. And all of a sudden the total food source available is lower than it was prior as well. And I see Karen has a chat and I can read that too. Like when wolves were killed at a national park and the deer went everywhere and ate everything. About 75 years later, wolves were reintroduced. The deer went back into the forest and nature became balanced again. Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, any sort of interference in an ecosystem has this ricochet effect. It doesn't just affect that one animal, it affects all the animals in a population. Absolutely. And there's something else too. So in addition to all of those other impacts, there's also that unwanted attention too. So, you know, we might have found this in our own backyards, whether it's, you know, feeding birds at our bird feeder, otherwise, you know, we put bird feeders in our garden because we want to see the birds that we want to see. And you might notice you'll get birds like pigeons that maybe you don't want to see, or if some of those seeds drop on the ground, now you have rodents coming into your yard too. So, you know, these food sources aren't necessarily discriminating for one animal or another. We are going to get all of those animals that want to take advantage of that food source. And so, you know, just like as we see in a lot of urban areas, if there's feeding sites for feral cats, if folks are feeding feral cats in one specific area, that can become a buffet for predators of those cats and for other animals that want to feed on that food source as well. And so, you know, like coyotes, if, you know, if there's a food source for these feral cats, it might bring in coyotes, it might mean more frequent visits by predators in our neighborhoods in general. And just on the topic of cats too, I always think it's important to mention that cats are voracious predators themselves. And so we want to make sure that we're supervising our cats because they do have an effect on our wildlife as well. And, you know, keeping them indoors as much as we can is usually good for some of our bird populations and other wildlife that we have in the area as well. And that is all I have on the impacts of animals, you know, at least as it comes to the negative impacts. Again, we are going to talk about the bad stuff first, but we're going to talk about some of the good stuff as well. But let's get some of this through. We're going to go into a little bit about the impacts on humans. And I thought this was a really funny photo to share. If we've gone to any national parks that have a healthy bear population, we might have seen something similar to this, you know, or maybe I know in the northern Nevada area, I live in Las Vegas, so we don't have bears down here, but I know around the Reno, Carson City area, there are definitely urban bear populations up there. And Cheryl says, black bears love bird seed. So Cheryl, I don't know if you live up in the Reno or northern Nevada area, you might have experienced that personally. So some of the ways that feeding wildlife can not only have an effect on the wildlife themselves, but on humans is an altered behavior of that wildlife. And that does affect us. So like you see in some of these photos, we have a picture, and this picture on the right is someone's hand. It was actually someone at Zion National Park. He said the squirrel had bit him in less than a second. And that's because a squirrel was conditioned to being fed by humans. And, you know, the more that they're fed by humans, they associate humans with food, they will come up to humans and, you know, get aggressive. It's not necessarily them wanting to be friends with us and have our food. They just start to see us as a food dispenser. And so however they can get that food, they're going to. And, you know, they can't necessarily distinguish where our fingers stop and that food begins all the time. And so it does lead to a lot of injuries in humans too by doing so. And any, you know, feeding any animal, and especially those larger mammals, does come with risks. And it comes with risks to not only us and our public safety, but as a result to those animals as well. You know, if we see animals that have become too conditioned to being fed by humans, especially animals like bears or coyotes, any predatory animals, that now becomes a public safety threat. You know, squirrels might not be as dangerous to us, aside from, you know, the potential risk of disease from getting bit by a squirrel. But when, you know, we get coyotes or bears that are being fed by humans, when those animals get aggressive, it's more of a public safety threat to us. And as a result, it usually doesn't end so well for that animal because typically they do have to be euthanized, or, you know, something needs to happen to remove that animal from the site. And it's not their fault. They, you know, they have become associated with humans as a food source. So they are just trying to act in their natural behavior to obtain what they want to survive. And I did want to share this. I don't know if y'all have seen it. If you've been to Zion National Park, they have this on all of their shuttle buses, and I just think it's hilarious. And it's a nice little kind of infomercial poster on a squirrel diet and how it is definitely best for squirrels to get their natural diet so that they can remain healthy in their environments and not get some of the food that they might be getting from the humans that make them a little too big for comfort in their habitat to survive. Something else that can occur as a result of feeding wildlife is property damage. So if we've ever been camping and accidentally left food out, you might notice animals getting to it. I know, for example, there was one time I was camping in the backcountry a few years ago in Utah, and I had these scent sealed bags instead of, I usually have a bear canister, but I thought the scent sealed bags would be okay to use in this specific area because there wasn't a bear population there. And I came back from hiking for the day, and I guess, I might not have sealed it well enough, but rodents ended up getting to it and my food was dispersed everywhere. And now I have 3 days with, half as much food. So again, that's not great for us. You don't want to be hungry in the backcountry for sure. But you can also have even more consequential effects, like a bear trying to break into your tent because food was left out. And so this kind of goes more along the lines of that unintentional feeding. But when animals do associate humans with food, they might not even need to smell it. But if they see a tent, they're going to start to associate that tent with food if they're used to getting a food source from that. And so in a way, we might be training these animals to make those associations, which we don't necessarily want them to make. April says, I saw a Zion National Park squirrel trying to steal a tourist backpack. Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of, especially the squirrels there, they're definitely conditioned to, want to grab that food source. They associate those humans or those food or property items with that food source. And so we want to try our best to make sure that we are limiting and reducing that as much as possible, just so that they can live naturally in their environment, because again, it helps them, but it also helps us and our property as well. And something else too, and I'm sure, and this goes back to going to a lot of our more visited public land spaces where we do see many more of those, human wildlife interactions, is vehicle collisions. So, animals that are fed out of the car from someone, they now start to associate, the roadways or the vehicles with a food source. And so just like if we're hand feeding an animal and they might bite our fingers as we're trying to feed them, they're now going to start to associate vehicles with that same thing as well. And, this goes from just feeding animals outside of our vehicles or littering too. If we're throwing food outside of our vehicles, these animals are now associating a food source with the roadways. And that causes collisions and animal fatalities, but it can also be very dangerous for us too, especially when it comes to those larger animals like elk and bear and deer. So we want to make sure that we're not training this wildlife to associate cars with food as well. Something else to keep in mind as well is the law. And this is, I think, a secondary consideration, because these laws are in place for all of the prior considerations. The laws aren't in place for no reason. It is because there are negative impacts on those humans and on those animals from doing these actions. But these are just some of the state laws and some of the Clark County and, surrounding city ordinances that revolve around the feeding of wildlife. So in many areas, in many state parks and national parks and public lands, it is very illegal to feed wildlife, whether it's big game, pigeons, birds. There are many areas that actually restrict and can fine you for feeding wildlife as well. And again, it's not just to, fine people for no reason. It is because of those negative impacts that we had discussed just prior. And I see a comment from Karen I can read. It says, Los Angeles is trying to build the largest above the highway passage for animals such as cougars so that they do not try to cross highways. Yes, so that is really cool. And this is implemented in several areas. They're wildlife corridors, and that's exactly what they're doing. And so, you know, as a result of our development, we've definitely segregated some of those habitat areas, especially for animals like cougars that do move among large territories. So by building a highway right across the middle of their territory, when they're trying to get from one way to the other, we do have those vehicle collisions or those animals that are trying to move on through. And so wildlife corridors are a really cool way to allow for the safe passage of these animals. Usually how you'll see them, and I'm curious to see how the Los Angeles one turns out. I didn't know that that was something in the making, so that'd be really neat to see what they have planned for that. Usually how I've seen them, it's an overpass over a highway that has some natural grass and vegetation features that kind of lead animals, you know, in a natural course of action across those areas, and have barricades surrounding the highway surrounding that to encourage animals to use that as a wildlife crossing. So last of the negative impacts we're going to talk about is the impacts on the environment. And so again, we've gone over some of those impacts on humans, those impacts on the animals. So let's talk about some of those environmental impacts, which really does kind of tie back into wildlife and into, you know, the effect on us, but directly as it relates to some of those ecosystem effects as well. Some areas where we see, especially with waterfowl or areas with urban ponds, we'll see what's called overcrowding. So again, it's those feeding sites, so where we see many, many animals gathering in one area to be fed by humans. This photo was actually taken at if you're familiar, the Veterans Memorial Park. This is in Boulder City. And these are ducks or other waterfowl that are waiting at the dawn hours. There's no one even here yet. They're waiting for their food to be provided to them. They have been so conditioned that they wait in the parking lot at a certain time every morning, knowing that that is the time that the people will come to provide food to them. And, you know, with that, we have an overcrowding of these waterfowl. Again, those delays in migration as a result too, and so then they'll stick around year round. And this leads to, you know, a harm to the habitat. So if we think about many, many animals sticking around year round instead of seasonally, now we're looking at effects on the biodiversity of the surrounding habitat. So whether it's the plants that are around, you know, or, you know, supplemental feeding can also cause the spread of invasive species too, especially if seeds are provided in one way or another. You know, we are innately wanting to provide a connection and a positive connection with wildlife, but oftentimes feeding them is not necessarily the connection that yields the greatest results. And I see Noreen mentioned, I do have pigeons that come to eat my wild bird seed, so I guess I should stop feeding. I have bird seed on the ground in fall and winter, and I shoo away the pigeons, but I can't keep them away all the time. And, you know, that's a really good point. And we'll talk about bird feeding too, because, you know, that is something that many of us are a part of. You know, I have a hummingbird feeder outside of my home, and we have bird seed available for the birds as well. And again, it's just, it's food that's provided to, you know, one species that we might want to see, but as a result, we might see other species as well. And so, you know, there are different techniques that we can implement to try to prevent that a little bit, but I think, you know, it's just good to keep in mind in general that sometimes that food that we provide might not just attract the animals we want to see, but other animals as well. And these are actually photos from that same urban pond area. And this is just showing the water quality that we have seen in ponds, in this pond, but also many other ponds, you know, whether it's in Nevada or elsewhere, many of the urban areas where we do have a congregation or overcrowding of waterfowl. You'll notice in that left photo, there is a lot of bird poop. That bird poop is not only gross for us to step on and be a part of, but that also ends up getting into the waterways and can really affect the water quality of an area. And you know, the subsequent muddy, clouded water that we see, that's usually because there's a lack of vegetation from those birds maybe eating too much vegetation. And so now there's no natural filtration in the water system. So there's a variety of things that can affect the water quality when we have too many animals occupying that space. Again, it's, you know, it's exceeding that carrying capacity of a certain habitat. Habitats are only capable of carrying a certain number of individuals in a given population. And so when that's thrown off balance, you know, we can see other effects like water quality as well. And a little bit more on the ecosystem imbalance side of things. We may have seen these animals before. You see on the left, that is a burrow. We have many, many burrow around the deserts here, especially in the southern Nevada area. And then on the right, you'll see carp too. And so these are two invasive species, or non-native, borderline invasive species that we have in our state. And these cause pretty significant impacts to our landscape, you know, whether it's the burrows that are, you know, overeating vegetation that, you know, outcompete some of our native species. And, you know, the same we see in the waterways where, you know, carp are overeating some of the vegetation in the waterways, or other fish as well, that, you know, really affects the population of some of those native species that are trying to survive in that same environment. And burrows, especially when they browse vegetation, they usually do it near springs too. So again, just like that waterfowl overcrowding a waterway area, these burrows can actually have an effect on some of our spring or natural springs in the area as well, and that water quality. Another thing too with the ecosystem imbalance, as we discussed just a little bit prior in regards to delayed migration. So, you know, that affects the birds. They're not able to survive in these now adjusted temperatures that they're not necessarily adapted for. That also affects the plant cycles that have sort of developed in certain habitats as a result of those relationships with the animals that surround them as well. And so you see in this picture here, if a bird, for example, arrives too early to a migratory site, those plants might not have grown to their full maturity or enough to provide food for those birds that are arriving into that area. But also when we see on this very right side, when there's no arrival of those birds as well, then we have an excess amount of that vegetation growing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing when it comes to that specific plant, but then we have to think about the space that, you know, that is occupying versus some of the other vegetation that might be growing in the overgrowth canopies that might be growing in that same area too. And so again, it's just a matter of balancing the ecosystem. And when we're interfering with the natural balance of things in any way or another, you know, there are those ripple effects that can occur as well. So that's all the bad stuff when it comes to feeding wildlife. And, you know, I don't want this to be a super negative webinar. You know, it is a topic that has quite a bit of controversy in one way or another, but I think it's a really good opportunity to kind of just understand some of the impacts that feeding wildlife can have on humans or on animals and on their environment. But, you know, we also want to just open our eyes to the natural ecosystem and the balance of the ecosystem. But let's think of some ways, and I would like y'all to use the chat if you can for this. Think of some instances in which feeding wildlife might have a positive or neutral effect. And, you know, some of these things I think we've already mentioned throughout the chat, but I would love for you to share. Or if you have any comments too regarding some of the stuff that we just discussed. I know I went through it kind of quickly, but if you want to open a discussion about some of that, I would like to take just a couple of minutes to try to open up that conversation and think about, you know, some of those positives or some of those ways that we think that, you know, might still be helping the wildlife when we do interfere in one way or another. And April says, yeah, maybe preserving endangered species. Yeah, absolutely. You know, if we have species that have critically, you know, dropped in population levels, we do want to interfere in some way or another, especially when we notice that those population declines are a result of humans. And so in areas where we've seen development take over habitats, there are, you know, again, it's some way of trying to give back. So when we have endangered species, we want to try to, you know, try to sustain their population or regain their population in some way or another to ensure that they can reach a healthy level again. And so whether it's providing food or other things to interfere and intervene to help that process, you know, to help them try to recuperate from, you know, from something damaging that we might have caused ourselves. Absolutely. And so whether that's, you know, providing food ourselves, I think in a lot of those situations, it, you know, it is up to more of, you know, a Fish and Wildlife Agency or Department of Wildlife, you know, agencies that have that professional, you know, research grade capacity where they can provide exactly what's necessary for these animals to kind of recuperate. Absolutely. And Karen says this year, especially with such a horrible drought, we may need to supplement some food, but only professionals should do this. Yeah, absolutely, Karen. So I know, for example, the Department of Wildlife has really helped, and this occurs during any drought periods too, so especially during these last months, these summer months, where we have guzzlers in place, and these are essentially giant like water barrel canisters that are in place and installed in remote desert areas. So we have some, for example, that are in the northwest side of Lake Mead, where we will actually helicopter large amounts of water to pour into these guzzlers so that there's a water source for some of those animals during that drought period. And, you know, that's to help revive some of that population or sustain that population during those drought periods. Definitely. And Carol says, we built artificial burrows for our burrowing owls due to habitat loss from solar installations. Yeah, absolutely. So again, it's, you know, it's rejuvenating that habitat in some way or another. So for sure, there's definitely ways that, you know, we can intervene to help some of our wildlife and our populations. Yeah, thanks for sharing. In summer, it's pretty hot here, so I provide food and water with a solar fountain so the birds will have water. And you clean the bird baths daily. I love that last sentence too. So if you're providing bird baths or bird feeders too, for that matter, you know, just making sure to clean and disinfect them is so important. Because again, you know, creating any sort of feeding site, you are inevitably going to get a congregation of animals. And so when those animals are interacting with one another, you know, it can encourage a spread of disease. And so making sure that those areas are disinfected is a great way to allow them to have that food and water source without, you know, the risk of transmitting disease between one another. Definitely. And that actually ties in well with the next slide of backyard birds. You know, this is probably one of the most commonly fed animals is those birds that we want to see in our backyards. And I think all of us can appreciate it. As I know, especially at the start of COVID, when we all started working from home and staying home, I was enthralled by looking at the birds outside of my window. It's, you know, it's something to observe while we may not be in our sort of our normal way of life, you know, trying to deal with these uncertain circumstances. Just being able to see and observe wildlife is a really great way to, you know, keep spirits high and, you know, see some of that natural beauty from our own homes. And so providing food for those birds is a great way to observe them. And again, just, you know, making sure that we are doing so in a way that's healthy for them. So providing them the correct food sources and disinfecting them so that we can ensure that they are safely eating and drinking from our backyard environments. And Holly says, what is the safest way to disinfect? I would just say, you know, just rinsing those feeders and bird baths with soap and water, you know, mild detergent, anything like that, and just making sure to scrub it and rinse it really well so none of that soap residue is left on it, and leaving it out to dry for a bit so no mold can develop in the seed. So making sure that before you put the seed in, just allowing it to dry fully before returning it outside is usually at least what I've done. And if y'all have any other input too, or any other tips and tricks that you've learned in terms of disinfecting your feeders, feel free to share that with Holly as well. And I'm sure everyone else would love to hear it too. And I think, the best thing to do when it comes to disinfecting is just to make sure that I know it's hard to do that on a daily basis, but trying to do it at least every few days to make sure that you're providing a safe environment for those animals. And something too, if you have a bunch of feeders in your yard, making sure that they're spaced apart relatively well. Because again, when we do have these crowds of birds coming to one area, especially if you have different seed in each of those feeders that might be attracting different species, to prevent, competition among species, but also fights between different species. It's good to keep those feeders pretty spaced out from one another. I know even with hummingbirds, if y'all have hummingbird feeders at all, you might notice that they get kind of aggressive with one another and also with other birds too, even for how tiny they are. And there's other birds too that can get kind of mean with one another. So just trying to make sure that they're kind of spaced apart too to provide a little bit of a safer habitat for them as well. And Jamie has a very good comment too, going back to those cats. So if you have outdoor cats, just making sure not to have feeders, absolutely. And outdoor cats in general, they are hunters by nature. As I'm sure any of you have observed in pet cats that you've had, or in other folks' pet cats, is they definitely do prey on birds and other small animals, chipmunks, squirrels. So just making sure that if you have to have them outside, which we definitely encourage indoor cats over having them outside, but if they are outside, just making sure that you don't have feeders or a food source for those smaller rodents or birds, because inevitably it might lead to some fatalities in those animals as well. Karen has a good point too, starlings. So starlings are an invasive bird species, and they are in many places too. I know from what I've noticed too, I feel like I haven't seen too many down here, but I know up in the Reno area, there's definitely a large population of starlings. I mean, not to say I haven't seen them here, but I have heard of them being a large nuisance up in that area. And they can provide health issues to humans, their droppings, and they definitely are not shy about their droppings too. And same with pigeons too. We'll see pigeon feces in many areas because pigeons definitely are very social birds as well. And so when we get large amounts of droppings in any one area, that can definitely become a health issue for humans. And feeding the birds brings in predators. It's nature, so you have to expect it, absolutely. And we live in a beautiful state. There is so much open, beautiful land in the state of Nevada. And I know that's, the reason why I live here is because I want to appreciate, down here, this beautiful desert environment, and I want to see this awesome wildlife. And I think with that, we also have to understand that, we are going to occasionally get some of that wildlife in our own yards too. So it's kind of that compromise we make to live in such a beautiful place with this awesome wildlife, is that sometimes they'll get kind of close to our backyards too. So just trying to create an environment that limits that, especially when it comes to animals that aren't as wanted in our neighborhoods, but just making sure that there is a safe environment for wildlife to survive as well. And this goes into a little bit of that as well, as something called naturescaping. And so this is a way to, if we are going to be feeding birds in our backyards, making sure it's native plants. We want to make sure that they are getting that, again, that diet that is appropriate to that specific species. And so naturescaping is a really great way to do that. And again, though, you have to keep in mind, if you're going to have a garden full of plants and shrubs and beautiful flowers to attract the birds and bees, you're also going to attract those other animals. So if you have rabbits that come in to forage on that, you might have predators as a result too. So just keeping in mind that any sort of modification that you do to your yard to attract one kind of wildlife inevitably has the possibility to attract other kinds of wildlife as well. And, naturescaping, especially in an area like, some of our urban environments that are so developed, it is a really great way to provide a stopover site for a lot of those migrating birds, provide an area that, they otherwise might not have anymore in our urban areas because of the development that we've had as a result. And of course, there's other ways to enjoy wildlife too. So whether it's in our backyard, whether we're naturescaping, some of the things that we mentioned at the start of this too was some of those ways that we like to observe wildlife. So whether it's on a hike or, even going to zoos or, doing things to see wildlife, in our own way. We don't have to feed wildlife in a wild environment, that usually leads to negative consequences, and we want to allow nature to be nature as much as possible. It's just so important for the health of those animals. And again, for the health of us and our environment as well, just allowing that ecosystem to balance in a very natural way. But there are so many other ways that we can see and enjoy wildlife. Just getting out into nature. If you have binoculars, that is a great way to see wildlife from a distance without having to get close. And field guides too. So, with our phones, with technology, a lot of this we can actually have on our very own phones. And there is, if y'all are interested too in learning a little bit more about some of the apps that you can use to observe wildlife, one of my coworkers has actually put on a webinar a few times, and you can find it on our YouTube page, and it goes over just how to use some of those different nature apps to observe wildlife. So, just some examples. One is called iNaturalist. That's a really great way, and it's sort of a community effort too. You can identify a species, and other users on iNaturalist can confirm the identification for you. And it also is a really great way to kind of track where these animals and plants are found throughout our state, throughout other states, throughout the world. And so it's a really awesome way to understand how these populations might move between states and their seasonality. And it's, it's a really great way for us as a community to kind of engage with one another and with the wildlife that we have in our areas. There's also one app I was introduced to recently. It's called the Seek app. And that's a really cool one because, especially if you're a little bit unfamiliar with specific plant or animal species, the Seek app, it's just a you open your camera on it and you move it's much easier with plants because they don't move. But you can move your camera setting around the plant to different areas and it'll identify it for you. Once it picks up on all of the details, it auto-identifies from a lot of the information that's pulled from iNaturalist. So that's a really great way to especially learn about some of the native plants that we have in our area. Jamie mentioned the Merlin Bird Id. Yes, absolutely. So Merlin Bird Id is a really great one, similar to iNaturalist too. And it's an awesome way where you can learn, the different bird species that you have, and you don't even need an extreme amount of information from it. You can essentially just plug in, what size that bird looked like from different images on the Merlin Id and what coloration you see and, various different details that you're able to pick up on. And from whatever details you're able to provide, it'll narrow it down to species that are in that area for you to determine what you're looking at. And they also have really cool bird calls that you can listen to on that app too, to familiarize yourself with some of the bird calls you might be hearing in your neighborhood as well. And I know someone mentioned if we could post or list those apps. So I don't know if Claire, if you would mind doing that in the chat, just so folks can kind of see some of those. But again, if you go to our YouTube page, the Nevada Department of Wildlife YouTube page, we have a whole webinar that's been recorded on how to use some of those different apps too, which is super cool. I actually attended it to learn more about it too. Something else we can do too while we're out enjoying the wild and our natural environments is just sitting down and, just be quiet, just embracing that quietness and really listening. And you'd be surprised by how much you can see and hear just with a little bit of stillness. I think, you know, especially in our world of technology and development and distraction, it's hard for us to sit still and, you know, just listen. But in wild environments, it's a really, really great way to, you know, feel more connected. You know, we don't need to feed wildlife to be connected to them. We can observe them, and a great way to observe them is from, you know, just sitting still and, you know, not exhibiting any sort of threatening behavior to these wildlife species that are out there. So stillness is a really great way to see them as well. And again, just respecting them with that distance. So we want to make sure that they maintain their wildness. And so we don't want to interfere with their way of surviving. When we are observing them, we want to do so in a way that's not affecting how they're surviving in any way. And this is a really cool image I saw that the Park Service put on in response to social distancing. So, you know, we're all practicing social distancing with one another, but there's a really great way to practice social distancing with that wildlife too. So these are just various images that show approximately how far you might want to be from some of these wildlife species you encounter. So, you know, we don't want to be getting right up next to a bear. It's probably not good for us. It's probably not good for the bear. We want to make sure we're staying a distance. And we probably don't want to be waving at bison either, attracting their attention. We want to see them from a very far distance. All right, at this point, I would just love to open this up to any more questions that you have or comments. We want to open the discussion a little bit more, you know, whether it's something we discussed recently or at the start of this program. I would love to stick around to answer any questions that y'all have or have had throughout the program that maybe weren't able to be answered in the Q&A at this point. It doesn't look like there's any pending ones that are open. I think Claire did an awesome job answering them all for y'all. But Claire too, if you got any that you wanted me to follow up on, please feel free to let me know as well. And thank you for posting all those bird apps or those animal ID apps in there too. They're all super awesome and helpful. I have all of them on my phone, and you know, you can switch between the different kinds depending on, you know, what you're trying to do with them. Oh, and yeah, Claire, if you don't mind posting the link to the YouTube channel, our YouTube channel too, that shows all of our webinars. And so we, at the start of COVID, we had been putting on a ton of different virtual programs just because we haven't been able to do what we love to do, which is in-person programs. And it actually really has opened up, you know, the doors to reach a lot more people and, you know, record some of these webinars so that we can reference them or folks can reference them for future instances too. So Claire did just post the link to that, and that shows some of the webinars that we've done in the past if you're interested in learning about other wildlife topics. We also have a bunch more on a weekly basis that occur throughout. And so if you follow us on our Facebook page or on Nextdoor, we post all of our upcoming webinars on those pages, or any social media outlets. You can find those on even our website. And, you know, again, if you miss those time slots, you're welcome to go on our YouTube page and view them at a later date as well. And Kenny asked, where are we posting the recordings? And that is on the YouTube page that Claire just posted a link to it. So if you click on that, you'll be able to see all of our previous webinars there. And we do have a survey too at the end of this webinar. So I would love if you could just add any comments or any suggestions. We love to hear feedback, especially, you know, as we're covering different topics, to see what you liked, what you didn't like, just so we kind of get an idea of some of the things that, you know, you might be interested in learning more about. You know, any suggestions for us, we always love to hear them. So any comments would be very appreciated. And also too, I do want to put in a plug coming from the urban wildlife side of things, is that at the end of February 22nd to 26th, we'll be having just about 2 webinars every day that week specifically on urban wildlife topics. So, you know, things like living with coyotes, if, you know, especially in our urban areas where we do have an influx of coyote populations. We're going to talk about different ways that we can manage wildlife in our urban areas and different ways that we can coexist peacefully with some of that wildlife that we have too. So if you want to sign up for any of those, please do so. We always welcome any and all participation in these. And I just want to say thank you all so much for joining me tonight. And I will be sticking around for just a few more minutes. If y'all have questions, I'm happy to answer any of them and all of them.